Right. Hi, good evening, everybody. We're just going to give it a moment here. Lots of people joining in, so we'll just give it about another minute and let everybody join the webinar here tonight. All right, great. Still some people joining us, but that's okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Don Giesbrecht, and I am the CEO of the Canadian Child Care Federation, and welcome to our Wednesday night webinar, Rethinking Nap Time. So great that so many of you have joined us here this evening. To start off, a land recognition that the Canadian Child Care Federation acknowledges that the land on which we are located is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize all Indigenous people who are here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As Indigenous peoples have done since the time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory and are occupied by many diverse peoples from near and far. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So again, thank you. I know some more people have joined us here, so welcome. For many of you, I'm sure this is not your first time doing a webinar, and more importantly, not your first time using this platform. But for those of you that are new to this, this is not like a Zoom where we can see everybody. As you know, your cameras are off except for ourselves. And I should introduce Robin McMillan, also from the Federation, and I'll introduce our presenters in a moment. Your cameras are off, and you can interact with us via the question panel or the question section within your control panel. So if you look at the control panel, you'll see there's a questions panel there. And if you want to ask us questions, if you've got technical difficulties, et cetera, please put your question in there. We will be bringing your questions to both Monika and Adam at the end, so we're not going to stop during the webinar to answer your questions. So if you do have something in there, by all means, we'll address it at that time. We have some polls that we're going to launch here for you to interact with throughout the presentation, so watch for those coming up on your screen. What else can I tell you? We'll be making a recording of this, and it will be available after post-webinar, and we'll also put it on the Canadian Child Care Federation's YouTube channel. You'll get a link to that. Robin will prepare certificates of attendance after the webinar, and they won't necessarily be out tomorrow, but they'll be out soon. So don't worry about that. You will get those, and we'll send all follow-up information to you as well. Tonight's webinar is actually supported by our friends and the great folks at Wintergreen Learning Materials. Wintergreen has been providing Canadian educators and childcare providers with unique, exclusive, and high-quality furniture, curriculum materials, and essential classroom supplies for over 40 years. As your partners in early learning and childcare, Wintergreen proudly supports the education, safety, and care of children across Canada through materials you can depend on and service you can trust. All their materials are backed with unique Wintergreen guarantee, and if you're not completely satisfied with any item you purchase at any time for any reason, simply let them know and they'll make it right. Trust Wintergreen's amazing after-sales service, friendly and knowledgeable staff, and exceptional selection. And we thank Wintergreen for their support. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Monika Szpunar. I hope I said that well, Monika. And Adam Newton, all right, from Western University in London, Ontario, both PhD candidates, talking about nap time. So this is something every childcare program does, but we don't talk about it very often. We don't talk about it as a form of practice. and I've had a sneak peek at their slides, and I think you're in for some really great information here tonight. So Monica and Adam, I will just make you presenter here, so just watch for that. We will pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dawn, for the introduction. Yes, we're both doing our PhD at Western University. Brief introduction from me. My research focuses on the early years, so children under 5 years of age, specifically measuring physical activity during center-based childcare hours. Research shows that children are the most inactive while they're in childcare, and so we try to incorporate strategies to get them to be more active, such as time outdoors, you know, using loose parts and different types of materials. And yeah, Adam's opened me up to the world of napping and the importance of napping as well as stopping napping. And so he's going to be really our team lead today. So I'll turn it over to Adam.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. Hi, Monica. Okay, what can you see here? Can you see the whole presentation? Can you only see half of it there?
I see about a third.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing it as well, Adam. So in the share my screen, make sure there's a like a start button in the main panel. Yep. Make sure that's clicked, and make sure it's showing your PowerPoint screen. There's a little drop down menu there.
Okay, sounds good. Just give me a moment here. Right, there's that. Try this time. We're only getting a third again. Give me 1 sec. Try this.
There we go.
Much better. Okay, great.
Yep, there we go.
Okay. Oh boy. And now my video pops up over top of it. All right, I think we're good to go. So my dissertation research is on napping in preschool kids specifically, with a focus on Canadian kids and how they sleep. So I'm going to share some of that dissertation research with you today. As well, I'm going to share some of the broader nap research and talk about this idea or dilemma of to sleep or not to sleep, and some of the myths about napping in preschool.
All right, and just some learning goals for today. We wanted to keep it interactive. So again, there will be some polls or some questions, stuff for you to keep in mind throughout. But we're hoping that by the end of today, you'll be able to understand sleep basics, recommendations for how much children under the age of 5 should be sleeping, specifically breaking down differences for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, the typical nap transition process, how physical activity and outdoor play can aid in napping, as well as we want you to appreciate stopping napping. A lot of us, again, don't talk about it. It's kind of a taboo subject about when kids should stop. And as well, we want you to understand the research-based recommendations for napping policies, and so really taking away what's relevant in the literature.
All right. So in order to understand napping, we first need to understand sleep. So the first thing we'll do today is talk a little bit about Sleep 101. What are the basic sleep processes that go on for kids and adults?
So just a first question here. What does everybody think? Do you think that any child will nap if they're tired enough? Maybe ponder that question. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a fun little question, and Adam will take up the correct answer.
Wow, so pretty nearly split right down the middle there. And it's certainly one of those things that is, you know, it's neither right nor wrong. It's certainly child dependent. And let's get into a little bit about how that is child dependent. So there's two main forces that make us sleep. So the first one we can think about is called sleep drive. And we can think about sleep drive like a car. And picture a car driving up a hill. As that car gets higher and higher on the hill, we get sleepier and sleepier to an eventual point where we'll be tired enough to fall asleep. That's true for kids, it's true for adults, and all points in between. When we have a nap or when we fall asleep at nighttime, that car goes down the hill on the other side, and our sleep drive is lowered to the point where we wake up in the morning. The other process is called the sleep or circadian rhythms, and we can think of this as the clock. So whereas that sleep drive is like a car driving up a hill, the sleep circadian rhythms, or our clock, has predictable patterns that sort of go up and down a little bit throughout the day. So a peak example of this is after lunchtime. You might feel more sleepy than you do during the rest of the day, and maybe you need a little caffeine boost. Some of our kids have a nap at that point. Some cultures have siestas at this point. And then that clock also peaks in terms of tiredness at around our bedtime as well. And sleep is most likely to happen when the sleep drive and the clock are working together. When they're both sort of at their optimum points, that's when we feel tired enough to fall asleep. If they're a bit out of sync, like maybe the clock is telling us that we feel sleepy, but we don't have enough sleep drive to fall asleep, that's when it can be tricky to have a nap for kids and for adults alike. We also need 3 conditions for sleep. So that first condition of sleep is we got to be tired enough, right? Like that sleep circadian rhythm, that clock, and that car need to be on the same page. We also have to feel safe enough. If it's an environment where we don't feel safe enough that we can fall asleep, it's difficult. Like we could think about camping and thinking that we might hear a bear outside of the tent. It can make it very difficult to fall asleep because the body doesn't settle down physiologically at that point. We also have to feel calm enough. So I think many of us have probably had the experience where our mind is running a mile a minute as soon as that head hits the pillow. And if we don't feel calm enough, we're not able to fall asleep. Same sort of thing for kids too. If something very exciting has happened or something very exciting is going to happen, it can be very difficult to settle down for a nighttime sleep or a nap. Just think about a young kid on Christmas Eve. So what actually happens when we sleep? Well, you may have heard about these different sleep stages that exist. So here is just a brief example of what it looks like for a kid. So we go in our sleep from being awake down through these different stages of sleep. We have this REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, where it's most often the case that we're dreaming at this stage of sleep. And then as sleep gets deeper in this non-REM sleep in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and 4, we become in a deeper state of sleep. If someone's in a stage 1 or stage 2 sleep, it's very easy to wake them up. If a kid's in a stage 1 or stage 2 sleep, very easy to wake them up. Much more difficult to wake somebody up if they're in a stage 3 or stage 4 sleep. And what we notice in nighttime throughout the night is sleep gets less deep as time progresses. So you can see, like, we go down into REM and then non-REM sleep to a very deep sleep stage, and then we might have a brief period of waking, or a kid might have a brief period of waking, and then they go back down a little bit, but to a point of sleep that's not quite as deep as before. Then they go up, and then it may not be quite as deep as before. This same sort of process is occurring during nap time as well, but it gets condensed. So across a nighttime where you might have a sleep period of 8, 10, 12 hours for a kid, where we can have multiple cycles of this lighter sleep, deeper sleep, and REM sleep, in a nap, we may have just 1 or 2 of these cycles, depending how long these naps are. So for like a 5-year-old kid, for example, every 45 minutes they're cycling through one of these. So if a kid is still napping at 5, they may go through 2 of these cycles in a 90-minute nap. Similar for a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. it's really important to understand these different kinds of sleep because they do different things for us, especially in terms of our learning. So deep sleep, these are our stages 3 and 4 sleep, that really difficult to wake people up kind of sleep. And then we have light sleep, where it's easier to wake folks up, and then REM sleep, the sleep where we're most likely to be dreaming in. In deep sleep, we can think of all the information we see throughout the day as trying to be made sense of by our mind. So different things that kids have learned, different activities that they've done, different friends and connections that they've made, people they've met. In deep sleep, this process goes into a little bit of a safe. It gets, on a sort of biological basis, kind of stuck in our brain for a little bit. And that's what we need deep sleep for, to help us remember these sorts of things. In light sleep, all this information comes out. And the role of light sleep on a brain-based level is to take this information out and decide what you need and what you don't need anymore. So in the process of light sleep, we might lose some information that's not all that relevant, it's redundant, or the brain feels that we don't need that so much anymore. And then in REM sleep, the role of REM sleep is to make connections between things that we've learned on a day and other pieces of information that we have in our mind. So these things get connected a little bit together so we can sort of make sense of them. And this is really good for kids to be able to learn and be able to pick up things like generalizing words to other scenarios, or generalizing memories, or generalizing pictures to other scenarios. So we need each part of this sleep because it's really important, and each part of these sleep stages serve a different role.
So we're just going to do another quick poll. We want to ask you what you think the most common signs of tiredness or sleepiness are in young children. There's 5 options currently on the screen, and we'll launch a poll and see what you think. We have clumsiness, crying, rubbing eyes or ears, grumpy behavior, or all of the above. Awesome. Yes, it definitely is all of the above with the addition of a few more. So you can think about your experience with, let's say, a 2-year-old. If they're ready for a nap, they will show some of these behaviors like rubbing their eyes, their ears, crying. They can be a little grumpy, or they just show, signs of frustration or agitation. They may be a little bit more sensitive or moody. These are all examples or behaviors that children exhibit when they are a little bit sleepy. And so just quickly to go over the National Sleep Foundation recommendations, there's 4 age groups that we're talking about when we're talking about the under 5s. And so you'll see on the slide 4 newborns, so with 0 to 3 months. They need 14 to 17 hours per day. And notice that this is an entire 24-hour day, because these children need to wake up and they need to be fed throughout those sleep periods. So they may not be getting an entire night's sleep compared to maybe their older peers, because they have more interrupted sleep. Therefore, their recommended sleep hours tend to be a lot higher. As we move up the age group 4 to 11 months, it drops down to around 12 to 15 hours per day. That's just a ballpark. Some children may be still sleeping on the higher end. Toddlers 1 to 2 years, 11 to 14 hours per day. And again, this is a 24-hour day because toddlers still are frequent nappers. And then when we move to preschoolers, 3 to 5 years, we see that the number declines 10 to 13 hours, day or night. So this is where we get to that age group where children, if they're sleeping throughout the entire night and maybe getting a 12-hour sleep, they might let go of that need for a nap because they're getting those quality deep sleeps, as Adam mentioned. And on the next slide, he's going to go over the recommendations by age and some trends that we see.
Yeah, so kind of same information here, right? But presented in more of a visual way. So we can see that, first of all, these are ranges. recommended ranges, the National Sleep Foundation will say that for some kids, they might be appropriately functioning just outside of these higher and lower end ranges. There's also quite a lot of variability here, but we do see a general decline in terms of recommended sleep as kids get older. And this is really facilitated by the process of moving those daytime naps into exclusively nighttime sleep. And I'll illustrate that. So here is what's going on in terms of napping and in terms of daytime sleeping. So what we can see here is that same kind of trend as the years go on. And this comes from a what's called a meta-analysis, fancy word for a study of studies where lots of information gets put together across multiple years of research, across multiple countries to look at lots of different trends. So there's a fair bit of information here, but we see that for a kid who is less than a year old, the average amount of sleep that they're getting at nap time is over 3 hours. But by the time we get to 5 years old, for someone who's still napping, the average amount of sleep is just over an hour, so it declines quite a bit. It's also important to remember with these numbers that kids eventually stop napping, and these numbers only reflect averages for those who are still napping. So for those kids who have stopped napping, their average sleep duration at nap time is 0 minutes. So that would pull down all of these averages, and they are not included in these numbers. So these are only kids that are still napping. It's this process that kids go through from many naps to 1 naps to no naps. And this is the preschooler nap transition. So we've got another poll for you.
So what do you think? Do you think that most 4-year-old kids should nap at least once a day? Considering that information that was just presented?
Right, so our group is split again. And again, it's going to be something that's individually dependent, for sure. Let's talk about the specific trends in just a little bit. So what is giving up naps all about? Well, as I mentioned, it's a process from going from many naps to a few naps to 1 nap to no naps at all. So in the first few months of life, sleep is really fragmented. It's characterized by a lot of short daytime naps and a short nighttime sleep period as well. And then in the first and second year of life, we see slightly longer daytime naps and slightly less frequent daytime naps coupled with a longer nighttime sleep period. Some kids at this age will also sleep through the night, which according to the research definition is 6 consecutive hours. So at nighttime, lots of kids will start sleeping 6 hours straight at nighttime and waking up, needing extra help to fall back asleep and sleeping through till morning. Somewhere between the 2nd and 5th year of life, something interesting starts to happen. And that's that we only get 1 daytime nap. And some kids have no daytime naps whatsoever. And we get yet again a longer nighttime sleep period. And then again, somewhere between the 2nd year of life and beyond, kids stop their daytime naps altogether and have a longer, uninterrupted, usually, sleep period. That's altogether all the sleep they need at once. But there's quite a lot of variability that happens there. So what I'm showing you here is a little bit more data, again, coming from that meta-analysis, that study across many different populations, many different countries, lots of data put together, that shows us in a nutshell something that we already know as people who work with kids, that most kids are going to stop napping somewhere between 2 and 5 years old. But we see quite a bit of range here. So on the the vertical side of the graph here, we see how many kids are napping in these different, or who have stopped napping in these different age groups. So at 1 year old and younger, 99% of kids are still napping, 1% of kids have stopped napping. When we get to 2 to 3 years old, about 1 in 3 kids have stopped napping, and 2 in 3 kids are continuing to nap. At 3 to 4 years old, we see that just over half of kids have stopped napping, and just under half of kids are still napping. And at 4 years old and 5 years old, the numbers are even higher, at 80% of kids that have stopped napping, and then 94, most of kids that have stopped napping at age 5 and older. So in answer to that question that we put up on the poll there, so kids who are 4 years old, most of them have stopped napping at that point, or are on their way to stopping napping relatively soon. And we'll talk about some of the factors that that depends on later on. So it's really interesting, I think, for me, like someone who researches this, but also for care providers, is this 2 to 3 year old age range. These are kids that are kind of stopping their naps earlier than their peers. And there's, quite a lot of that variability going on here. If you applied a universal policy for these kids to serve the many, it would be one that includes and encourages napping. But for 1 in 3 of these kids, that is not what their body needs. And we'll talk about some of the reasons behind that as we go on. So that universal nap policy that serves the many might be to the detriment of about 1/3 of kids here. Let's talk a little bit about how napping can help.
So just quickly going over some of the benefits of napping that the research has shown. Children who are in their younger years, a study outside of Canada showed that if they nap, prior to their nap, they're learning something, for example, their ABCs or their 1, 2, 3s, they can have higher short-term memory boost after that nap compared to children who don't nap. And this is very similar to language and literacy skills. So for example, if you're reading a book or maybe teaching children the words of the alphabet, they're more likely to remember or be able to recall if you ask them, hey, what sound does C make, or what word starts with C? They're more likely to remember that after a nap. And then finally, one of the biggest benefits to napping is that it offers a break to those who care for young children. Caregivers, parents, anyone who understands what it's like to have a child who's awake many hours of the day. And so we can talk about how to encourage napping. One important thing is following a schedule or routine. So thinking about children in childcare, some of them are only there part-time. If they're at home Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and they're used to having a nap, as Adam mentioned, after a meal, that's going to translate into their routine when they're in childcare. Some children are fearful of missing out, and so they force themselves to stay awake because they want to have fun. But oftentimes, having a routine or a schedule will encourage a child to nap. Of course, physical activity, getting your heart pumping and your body sweating, that can increase sleep as well. Most often, it translates to better nighttime sleep, but also early childhood educators have sung their praises to us when we've been doing a physical activity intervention, saying that active toddlers make for better sleepers. And same with outdoor play. Outdoor play actually encourages that circadian rhythm because you're getting that vitamin D and sunlight. And so it can promote a better night's sleep or a better nap. But most importantly, it's really important to know that if a child doesn't want to nap, you shouldn't panic because they may just be outgrowing it, as Adam mentioned. And so just going over physical activity a little bit more. If you think about yourself and a day where you've spent the morning outside on a hike, or you're just outdoors for an extended period of time, that increase in oxygen and that exposure to sunlight may make you come in and go, wow, I feel a lot more tired today than normal. It's completely normal because it's releasing melatonin and you're releasing endorphins that can increase sleepiness. And so that's why it's really important that we kind of follow all of the 24-hour movement behaviors all in one, like limiting sedentary behavior, limiting screen exposure to those lights that kind of stray us away from being able to sleep, and then following a good nighttime sleep schedule in order to reap all of the benefits.
All right. So on the flip side of things, when do we know that kids are ready to stop napping? What are some signs that kids are ready to either stop or reduce the amount of time that they're spending napping?
So what do you think? Do you think that it's easy to tell when a kid is old enough to stop napping? Equal split again.
Maybe some among us are more expert than others. So we can think about this in two different ways. We can think about it in terms of a big picture, and then we can think about it as a specific picture for kids. So some of the research that I have done with my supervisor at Western, Dr. Reed, and colleagues there, has been looking at what some of the population sort of predictors are of when kids give up their naps earlier than their peers. So one interesting thing that we do find is that Canadian kids actually nap until older than kids in Europe. That's a sort of an interesting kind of country difference that we're seeing in some of this research. We also know that boys tend to nap until older ages than do girls, and that kids who are born at lower birth weights are more likely to nap until older ages than kids who are born at typical birth weights. And the cutoff for this that we would use is under 2.5 kilograms, which is the Health Canada guideline. We see some other population trends as well, that kids who have met fewer developmental milestones, so things like your classics, walking, number of words, social milestones, tend to nap until they're older than kids who have met, that should say more milestones. Apologies for the error. We also know that both in our research and in the research of others in other countries like the United States, that kids who are non-white tend to nap until older ages than do white kids, suggesting some potential cultural differences at play here as well. And finally, we know that kids that have an older sibling nap until older, or sorry, kids that have an older sibling tend to nap until older than kids without an older sibling. In terms of more specific to child reasons that kids might be ready to give up their nap, two of the biggest signs are the kids simply won't fall asleep at nap time, and that the child does well without the nap. So like Monica mentioned, those signs that kids are sleepy and ready for a nap, they may not be there for kids who are ready to either transition out of naps entirely or reduce the number of naps they're having throughout the day. So tangibly, we might see fewer mood swings, and we might see an activity level that's maintained instead of dipping or becoming more snuggly at a time that was typically nap time. This is what you might see in a childcare environment, especially as ECEs. What you may see less of are these nighttime signs. And this is where, that communication with the parents and caregivers at home becomes important for helping to make an informed decision on this. So when the child is napped and they're ready to stop napping, what a parent might see is that it takes a longer time for kids to fall asleep at night when they're napping and they don't actually need that nap anymore. And they also might wake up more at night than they ordinarily would. So their sleep is less together. It's becoming a little bit more fragmented than we would have expected. The final thing that we can see at nighttime is when the kid wakes up in the morning, they may wake up much earlier in the morning than usual, and they stay awake. So they have a really hard time settling back to sleep. And if we think about this, this makes a lot of sense. If we think about those two forces of sleep, sleep drive and the sleep circadian rhythms or the clock. Because if a kid doesn't need a nap anymore, then their car is driving up the hill, they're taking a nap, and it's going down the hill a little bit. And it has less opportunity to drive up the hill to the point where it needs to be in order to fall asleep at nighttime and stay asleep at nighttime, because it hasn't got quite high enough up that hill. So sleep drive is being reduced if kids are napping beyond the point that they might actually need that nap. So how can stopping naps help kids? Well, we know from many research studies that kids who stop napping tend to have better receptive language skills. Receptive language skills are those skills where kids are good listeners. They can follow directions, they know what words mean. And the really neat thing about receptive language skills, those abilities to hear words and understand them, is this is our very best predictor in preschool of later intelligence. Kids who have better receptive language skills in preschool tend to have higher intelligence scores when we can measure that more reliably in childhood and adolescence and beyond. We also know that kids who stop napping earlier than their peers tend to have lower anxiety. They're better able to regulate their emotions compared to kids who are still napping. The important thing with this is it's not as though we could have a kid stop napping and have all these benefits come in. Rather, it is much more likely that these things are sort of happening together. That there's something special about napping and that process of stopping it that is helping these skills come online. And we cannot achieve that by stopping kids from napping. It only happens when they stop napping naturally. So when kids have stopped napping but are told to continue to nap or are put in a situation where they're encouraged to nap, they're more likely to have trouble sleeping at night. So they're going to have those difficulties falling asleep. It might take 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half for them to fall asleep. There may or may not be tears and screaming as part of that process. There may or may not be running out of the room as part of that process. There will be trouble for them staying asleep at nighttime as well and needing a caregiver to help them settle back to sleep again potentially. And they may wake up too early relative to how they've been waking up before. The other aspect here is potentially a more serious one, that there's emerging evidence that when kids continue to nap beyond the point when they have biologically matured to the point where they don't need that nap anymore, that they're going to miss out on some of that deep, slow wave sleep that's really good for helping us remember those pieces of information that we've learned throughout the day, those faces, those pictures, those word sounds, and so on. And this can lead to some difficulties potentially in being able to learn and being able to remember things. So I want to end here with a final point before we get into some questions about what the science says and what some emerging directions are for early childhood educators. So this information comes from a group in Australia that is doing amazing work in regards to the under 5 age group and napping. Tons of great research that comes from this group in Australia. And what they have suggested is that for kids that have stopped napping, there's no evidence at all that continued napping provides any benefit. Some of those, reasons to encourage naps and support naps in terms of what Monika was talking about in terms of having kids who learn something and then they have a nap and they're better at remembering that. That evidence is only true for kids that nap consistently. It doesn't hold up for kids that have stopped napping. They don't see the same sort of memory boosts anymore. It only works for kids who are consistent nappers. and it can potentially lead to harm for kids who are napping beyond the point that they need to. At a very kind of basic level, they're missing out on nighttime sleep, which can cause fatigue for caregivers, and it can cause them to the kids to miss out on that deep slow wave sleep. However, kids who have stopped napping should continue to have access to quiet time, because what some emerging research has shown so far is that although kids don't benefit from napping in the same way when they have stopped napping consistently, they do continue to benefit from quiet time. A little break for their brains can provide similar sorts of memory boosts or reset points instead of napping. For kids who are consistently napping or are at some point along that transition, naps can give a memory and learning boost, and they should have access to a daily nap time. So this research is really advocating, and my dissertation research also supports this, that a flexible napping policy is going to be best. One that accommodates kids who have stopped napping and lets them have access to quiet time, and one where kids who are still consistently napping have access to that daily nap. So in terms of the key takeaways, we really hope that you take away from this presentation that each child is going to have unique needs. We can think back to those napping trends, right? 2 to 3 years old, about a third of kids have stopped their naps and 2/3 of kids have not. That's really quite variable. The next age group up, it's about 50-50. And although there are some benefits for napping, there's also benefits to stopping napping. Finally, there's no demonstrated benefits for kids to keep napping after they've naturally stopped napping. And in fact, it can lead to some harm for kids in terms of nighttime sleep consequences and missing out on that deeper sleep.
So we'll open the floor to any questions. Definitely an information-packed session. So anything that comes to mind, feel free to ask away.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam and Monika. That was fantastic. Great information for everybody. And so we do have some questions that have come in here. And everybody, as I said earlier, if you want to type your questions in on the question part of the panel, please do so. So the first question here, even though children aren't napping, is a quiet time or downtime still helpful or appropriate?
Yeah, definitely. So it's a great idea. And to re-emphasize some of that research that I was talking about in the last couple slides there, the emerging research is showing that quiet time, that downtime is providing similar sorts of effects for the kids who have stopped napping. So it's an excellent idea and something that should be continued to be offered to those kids that have stopped napping.
Great. Just an observation here that somebody made. They said sometimes when kids are overtired, they quote, can't sleep, which confuses people. Is that accurate to say, Adam and Monika?
I've experienced that as a parent of a young kid. I've seen it happen. For kids who are consistent nappers or at some point on that transition process, if they don't have a good nap during the daytime, nighttime sleep can be really difficult. And then when nighttime sleep becomes difficult, the nap the next day can become difficult as well. Sometimes your sleep drive is just at the point where you got irritable. Kids are more likely to experience irritability as a sign of sleepiness than we are as adults, but certainly we feel that too. So that can certainly happen. Kids are overtired and it becomes very difficult for them to sleep. So it can be a battle for a few days before getting things back on track.
Yeah. Lots of questions here, or a number of questions, I should say, just about that, going back to that initial, or one of the ones we just asked about the quiet time. What does that look like? How long should that go?
I think that's an excellent question. So, I mean, unlike the sleep period itself, where a kid who's done napping naturally, if they have a nap there, it may impair their nighttime sleep. it's unlikely that a prolonged quiet period is going to have any detriment to nighttime sleep, because it's not going to have the same sort of effects on um, that sleep drive and bringing that car down that hill, right? So, it could, on a very practical stance, it could coincide with the length of naps for your kiddos who are continuing to nap, and that could work without any potential consequence. I'm not aware of any research that's talked specifically about an optimum length. I think it's going to vary kid to kid about how much attention you're going to be able to keep with them in that quiet time before they're going to need more active play. But anywhere from half an hour to an hour, hour and a half, could work. It's going to be really flexible, but you're not going to run into the same kind of sleep issues at nighttime with a quiet period than you are a nap.
And should that time be completely still? Because this is coming through as well. Should that be, no, you need to lay down, or should it be you need to sit quietly and, here's a book or here's a small toy to play with? Like, is it just no stimulation at all at that time?
Yeah, like low level stimulation. Like we're talking about keeping the running games to a minimum, I think would be a fair one to say. But like something like a book or coloring, lying there if that's what the kid wants to do, like these sorts of lower stimulation, quiet-like activities, I think like if there was like one could have a menu of options in that area, right? Like a kid could lie there if they wanted to, they could play with some stuffed animals, they could color, they could read a book or have a book read to them, these sorts of things. All of these things would be appropriate to satisfy those kind of quiet time areas.
Great, thanks. Couple of questions here about the Australia study that you cited. Is this something that regular non-academics could access and read, or is it purely academic?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's out there. It's certainly out there. So I believe Robin's going to send out some resources that we'll pass along, so I can include the link to that. I will do a refresh on my copyright laws and see if it's something that I can actually send the PDF for or not. But sometimes if you like just Google the names of these things, you'll be able to find a free PDF of it. That meta-analysis study that I talked about, that study of studies, is also from that Australia group. That one's a bit more dense, certainly. But the one that I talked about at the very end is a little bit more accessible. So I'll see if I can find a public domain version of that PDF to send out. Particularly the last few pages of that article are pretty accessible. Not a lot of stats in there. Not a lot of unnecessary terms and things like that. Pretty accessible stuff.
Great, thanks, Adam. So again, to reiterate, everybody, if Adam can find something that is allowed to be shared, we will send it out so you have that. So this is a really good question. I think this will resonate with virtually everybody on the webinar tonight. What do you do when you have a parent that comes in and says, my child's not sleeping at night, they absolutely cannot sleep at the childcare program today? What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's my immediate reaction. I'll offer I'll offer some general guidance, but I think that everyone on the call is an expert on their own parents and their own clients at their daycare centers. So you're probably gonna put your own spin on this and feel what you need to feel with whatever relationship you have with the parent or the caregiver. It's a legitimate concern that parents could have. And as the care provider, you can only do so much. You can encourage the child to stay awake, but if they're cranky and if they're upset and if they're getting clumsy and they're getting cuddly and it's really clear that they need to sleep, maybe that's not what's going on at home. Maybe it's not that they're transitioning. Maybe it's a broader sleep issue. So if that's the case, I mean, you can certainly recommend that the parent consult with their family doc or a clinical psychologists are good folks to talk about sleep issues, or pediatricians that the parent could consult with. Because I think you can only try your best with that. And if you need to point them in the direction of additional resources, I think that's an appropriate role to play as well sometimes, whether it's the ECE or the center director.
Mm-hmm. So following up a little bit on that, then the parents ask, and no nap, and you try to respect it in the program, but that child is falling asleep in their sandwich. Do you keep that child awake at all costs? Do you give them a bit of downtime but limit it? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think navigating that with the parent is a good idea. Like coming up with a bit of a plan together and sort of saying, this is what's going on. Like, your son or daughter is falling asleep at lunch. Like their head is in the jam sandwich. They really do still need a nap sometimes. If you remember this piece of information about this transition of naps, that might be an important one to point parents out to as well, right? That this is not something that's going to happen immediately. There's going to be some days in this transition where the kids are going to nap a few days a week, and some days where they're, not going to nap at all. I'm looking at this how many days a week do kids nap in their transitioning information right now, and it's a very kind of stepwise transition that goes on here. But some things that people can do in terms of making that plan with a parent would be thinking about what can you limit. Can parents and the EC come to terms about when a nap is going to happen? Like having a nap at 1 o'clock is going to be less likely to affect nighttime sleep versus having a nap at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. The later in the day that nap is, the less opportunity that car has to drive back up that hill and get sleepy enough for bedtime. They can also think about the length of that nap. So a 2-hour nap is going to be harder on nighttime sleep than a 1-hour nap. So maybe child's falling asleep in their sandwich, so maybe a 1-hour nap is going to be appropriate, and maybe that'll lead to less of an impact on nighttime sleep than will just allowing that child to sleep for the whole time and naturally waking up.
Mm-hmm. Great.
What the
Thanks.
research would generally, I was just going to add one more piece
Well, go
there.
ahead.
What the
Please,
research
please.
would generally suggest is cutting naps off at 4 is generally a good idea. Not letting kids sleep any later than 4, unless they're sick or unless they had a really bad night's sleep the night before and you're really trying to make up that fatigue.
Okay, thanks, Adam. What about, because I think this happens a lot in programs where staff, ECEs sit and providers sit with the children, rubbing backs or rocking them. Some seem to need it more than others. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's another excellent question. And obviously, as people have experienced, right, like it's something else that varies child to child. Generally, kids need the same thing to fall asleep at nighttime that they do during the day. So generally, kids who are having their backs rubbed when they're falling asleep during nap time are probably getting something similar to that from their parents. There's actually nothing inherently wrong with that. One of the things that we do want kids to do as they grow up and transition from preschool age to school age is be able to fall asleep independently at nighttime. And it's a really good skill to have, because what sometimes happens is the kid might fall asleep either at nap time or at nighttime, and they wake up like 15 minutes later and they need the same thing again. They need that back rubbing. And then sometimes what also happens is each time you kind of come out of one of those sleep cycles, about every 45 to 90 minutes, you kind of need that same thing again. If you're consistently getting backs rubbed. So it doesn't really, there isn't a lot of consistent research right now to say that that's inherently problematic from a memory and learning perspective. it just becomes a bit more of a hassle sometimes for caregivers, right? Because it just means you need to be more hands-on. So usually it becomes a matter of choice. And if you know, ECEs and care providers are good with that, then it's okay to continue that.
Great. What I know you've touched on this throughout the presentation and just a couple moments ago too, but what about timeframes? Should there be you know, a set amount of time per age, or you know, because a lot of programs obviously build their routines around and so, you know, to your earlier slide about routines, I think that it falls into childcare very well. But what about timeframes, right? Should a nap time be an hour long? Should it be 2 hours long? Is it age dependent? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. It's yet another one of these really good questions that's really individually variable, right? As one could like refresh on once the PDF of the slides are out there, if we think about the average nap duration, dependent on age groups, right? Like for our under ones, our infants, it's a 3 hour period, and it's not necessarily all at once. It's usually multiple naps throughout the day. And then for our 3 to 5 year olds, roughly an hour to an hour and a half in there. So I think that's a good starting point for programming. Think about the averages. Schedule at least that amount of time with potentially an extra half-hour buffer for the kids who are longer nappers, and work from there. In the ideal circumstance, and I know this is much more easy to talk about than it is to implement, but having the opportunity for the non-nappers or the kids that are shorter nappers to have that quiet time following that nap period would be an ideal circumstance in terms of scheduling. When you're for the vast majority of the 3 to 5 year olds, we're talking about one nap in a 24-hour period, and that longer sleep period. Most kids have consolidated at that point into just one daytime nap and then a longer nighttime sleep period. And usually that's occurring in the early afternoon, sometime between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock at the beginning of napping. Again, broad strokes. Like that's going to change a little bit kid to kid, but from a programming perspective, you're probably safe there in the 2 to 3 age range. Below that, you may need to incorporate the you know, something around the 10 a.m. area, and then something in the afternoon as well, whether it's 1 or 2 or 2:30.
Thanks. This is a good question too, I think, at least. What is the ideal sleep environment? Music versus white noise, closed blinds versus half open, as silent as possible? What are your thoughts, or what does the research say about that?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And it's actually it's pretty well an open question in terms of preschoolers and napping environments. A lot more of that research has been done on nighttime sleep, and we can just make our best guesses that that research generalizes fairly well to nap time. If we think about like consistent environments from nap time to nighttime sleep as well. So what the nighttime sleep literature says for best sleep environment, we want a cool but not cold room, shooting for somewhere around 21 degrees or so. We want it dark. We want it free from noises that are too loud but also abrupt, right? Sudden noises would be detrimental. So like there's a couple different ways to achieve that, right? Like you could ask for absolute silence, but good luck with that. So doing something like a white noise or a soothing sound in the background, rain sounds, nature sounds, quiet lullaby, can help to drown out some of those sudden and unexpected noises as well. Those would be the big ones.
Great. I know we're at the top of the hour here, so if I can get one more question in, because we all, or most of us, Saskatchewan excluded, did not have this happen. What about time changes and dealing with children and those changes, as you talked about, to those circadian rhythms and whatnot? How do programs manage that?
Yeah, they're the absolute worst, aren't they? These time changes. And I feel that much more strongly again now that I'm a father of a toddler. So what the research says is if you can make that change gradually, you are setting yourself up better for success. Unfortunately, you're getting your best shot if the parents are also on board with this kind of slow, gradual transition. Over the course of just over a week, moving the sleep periods back or forward, depending on which direction we're going for the time change, to accommodate for what that new time change is going to be, right? So moving nighttime sleep back by 15 minutes for 2 days, moving the nap back for 15 minutes for 2 days, and then doing that again, and then doing that again until we get to the new time. That can set kids up for a lot of success and make that transition much smoother. The alternative is trying to do that after the fact. Like the time change has happened, the kid is, in the case of us springing ahead here, temporarily going to bed a little bit later, napping a little bit later, and then you move that back after the fact to accommodate to the new time change. But you know, I appreciate that that's a huge logistical challenge because you kind of need everyone in the center on the same page for it to work best. It doesn't mean that an ECE can't try with moving naps back for their particular classroom or center. But just know that you could do the very best you could. And if parents aren't also doing that at home, it just might not work.
All right, thanks. There's lots more questions here, but I appreciate that we're at the top of the hour, and I don't think we're going to be able, well, we can't get to all of them, but I think there's a lot of themes that are very similar here. So I think we've really hit the high notes and many others. So really appreciate this, Adam and Monika. So Robin, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks so much, Monika and Adam. This has been amazing. And I thought of a personal story while you were talking. When I used to work frontline childcare, I remember we had the soft music going, the room was dim, the lights were down, all that stuff. And I was playing some Enya song or something, which I thought was particularly soothing. And right in the middle, right when we had all of the kids, or the majority of the kids asleep, this little boy decides he's going to sing it, and he belts out the chorus as loud as he can to Sail Away. So you can just imagine what that sounded like. And the whole class woke up. It was I just laughed. I mean, you have to laugh. It was ridiculous. But it's just so challenging, really, when we talk about nap time in preschool programs and what people have to, what the practitioners are dealing with between the children's needs and the parents' wants and all that kind of stuff. And I think you've done a great job in showing us different ways to balance that, and the ideas of forming sleep plans. I mean, we don't often think of that. You know, we think of all sorts of other plans that we do with parents, but really to develop a sleep plan with a parent, I think would be a wonderful opportunity to open dialogue and share some of this great information that you've been able to provide for us too. So on that note, we will be sending a follow-up email, which we will put in the copy of the PowerPoint, which of course is copyrighted to Adam and Monika, but that you'll be able to have that information and you can share that when you're having these conversations with parents and families. And also we'll send any additional links we can find in that email as well. There'll also be a survey link, which I'd like to encourage you to do a very brief survey, but it really helps us inform what we want to do for our next webinar and things that you guys are really interested about and what you want to see with your professional development. So we really appreciate it if you could take the few moments to fill that out, and we'll be sharing that information as well with Monika and Adam, so it helps inform their work too, which is important. Let me see what else. I also wanted to let you know about, oh, did I tell you about certificates? Yes, they'll be sent out by the end of the week too. And our next webinar coming up is next Wednesday, actually, which traditionally we don't do them so close together, but it just worked out this way. It will be all about providing healthy, sustainable childcare environments. And we're doing that together in partnership with the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment. I know their acronym KIPSHE. I always have to look at their full name. And it'll be really exciting. We'll be talking about the new Healthy Childcare Checklist that they're just soon to release. It's a beautiful online resource that you guys are going to love. And as well, we're going to be talking about indoor air quality and some things to do to ensure you stay healthy during things like COVID. So that'll be, I think, really interesting for practitioners. And if you want to know more information actually about that webinar coming up next week, you can visit our website and look at our webinar page, also our Facebook page. There's details on how to register there in our event listings. And I think that webinar also will be done in French, although I know everyone on here pretty well is English, but we'll be providing that particular webinar in French as well a week later. So thank you again, participants, for joining us. This has been an amazing opportunity to touch base with practitioners across the country. And we're hoping to be bringing you more and more webinars like this throughout the next few months. We're going to try and do one the last Wednesday of the month. So mark your calendars. The last Wednesday of the month, we're going to try and provide you with this opportunity to do some professional development online. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Monika and Adam. It was great and so much information. My mind's just, my synapses are firing. But yeah, thanks so much. It's been a great opportunity to meet with you guys and share your information.
Thank you so much for having us, Robin and Don. I appreciate the opportunity.
I hope everyone has a good sleep tonight.
Yes.
Okay, bye-bye.